The emergency ward fell into an uneasy silence that none of the alien staff could explain. The alarms had stopped. The monitors had settled into a rhythm that should not have existed. Dr. Harrison remained frozen beside the examination table, staring at the display as though it had betrayed everything he had learned during 3 decades of medical practice. Emily looked from the screen to John's face, then back again. "Doctor," she said quietly, "his vital signs are stabilizing." Harrison did not answer right away. He reached for another scanner and slowly passed it over John's chest. The transparent projection above the bed shifted through layers of muscle, bone, and damaged tissue. Every expected failure point was already changing. Ruptured blood vessels were sealing. Swollen tissue was shrinking. Bone marrow activity had increased beyond anything recorded in the Coalition medical database. Harrison finally spoke, but only to himself. "This is impossible." Emily folded her arms. "Or maybe we simply do not understand humans as well as we thought." Outside the treatment room, several alien physicians had gathered behind the observation glass. None of them entered. They watched quietly, exchanging nervous glances while the data streamed across the monitors. One of the taller physicians adjusted his translation collar. Did the anesthetic trigger a dormant survival response? Another shook his head. There is no documented species capable of recovering from that level of systemic collapse. Harrison tapped through the medical history Earth had submitted years earlier when humanity joined the Coalition workforce. The file looked surprisingly short. It listed common illnesses, vaccination records, average bone density, and emergency procedures. There was almost nothing about extreme trauma recovery. "Their records are incomplete," one physician muttered. Emily frowned. "Those records were never classified. You never asked the right questions." Harrison looked toward her. "Explain." She took a slow breath. "Humans have survived losing limbs in industrial accidents, military service, farming, construction, and disasters for generations. We build prosthetics. We adapt. We go through rehabilitation. We keep living." The room became quiet again. One of the alien doctors blinked several times. "You are saying this has happened before?" Emily nodded. "Many times." Harrison stared at John. "Then why was none of this discussed during first contact?" Emily gave a tired smile. "Because most humans do not introduce themselves by listing every terrible thing they have survived." John shifted slightly beneath the blanket. His eyes remained closed, but his breathing had grown deeper and steadier. Harrison noticed something else. The neural activity across the damaged areas was reorganizing instead of shutting down. Every minute the scans looked a little better. "Increase observation frequency," Harrison ordered. "No medications unless absolutely necessary. Record every biological change." One of the technicians hesitated. "Should we notify Coalition Command?" Harrison answered without taking his eyes off the patient. "Not yet. I want evidence before politicians decide what this means." Emily quietly adjusted John's blanket. "He is going to wake up." Harrison looked doubtful. After everything his body experienced? She met his eyes without hesitation. "Doctor, you have treated humans for years. We complain about bad coffee. We argue over baseball. We worry about paying bills. Then life knocks us down, and somehow we get back up. It is practically our favorite hobby." For the first time since the accident, Harrison allowed himself a faint, uncertain smile. He glanced once more at the impossible numbers filling the display before speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps the galaxy has spent too much time studying human technology and not nearly enough time studying human resilience." John Mercer woke to the steady hum of environmental systems instead of emergency alarms. His mouth felt dry, his muscles heavy, but the crushing pressure that had overwhelmed every nerve in his body was gone. He blinked several times as the sterile blue ceiling slowly came into focus. Emily noticed the movement almost immediately and hurried to his bedside. "Welcome back," she said with a relieved smile. "Can you hear me?" John swallowed before answering. "I have had better Tuesdays." Emily laughed quietly, more from relief than amusement. "That is probably the most human answer you could have given." Harrison stepped forward carrying a handheld scanner. His expression remained calm, but John noticed the doctor was studying him with the same curiosity someone might reserve for an impossible scientific discovery. "Mr. Mercer," Harrison said, "I need your permission to perform another examination." John raised one eyebrow. "Am I dying again?" "No," Harrison replied honestly. That is precisely the problem. According to every accepted biological model, you should not be recovering this quickly. John looked down at the thick biogel covering much of his left side. The pain was still there, but it had changed into a dull ache that reminded him of long construction shifts back on Earth. Trust me, doctor. I still feel like I got hit by a freight train. Harrison slowly nodded. Pain is expected. Recovery at this rate is not. The scanner passed over John's shoulder once more. Fresh tissue growth appeared across the projection. Emily leaned over to study the image. That is even better than an hour ago. Harrison lowered the scanner and looked directly at John. I have a question that may sound unusual. Go ahead. If a human permanently loses part of the body, what normally happens? John looked puzzled for a second. Depends on the injury. Doctors save what they can. If they cannot, people learn to live with it. Prosthetic arms and legs have been around for a long time. Physical therapy does the rest. Harrison waited, expecting more. That is all. John shrugged. Pretty much. It is not easy. Nobody wants it to happen. But life keeps moving. The doctors behind the observation glass exchanged quiet conversations. One finally entered the room carrying a tablet filled with coalition medical references. Dr. Harrison, I searched historical Terran records. Harrison looked up. And the human archives contain thousands of documented cases involving severe physical trauma, followed by years of productive civilian or military life. The room fell silent again. Emily folded her hands together. You believed survival required perfection. Humans learned a different lesson a very long time ago. Harrison slowly walked toward the observation window. Beyond the glass, dozens of alien staff members had quietly gathered. Some were surgeons. Others were researchers. None of them looked frightened anymore. They looked fascinated. One younger physician asked the question everyone else seemed afraid to ask. If humans can continue functioning after injuries that would permanently disable most species, how do they remain psychologically stable? John answered before Harrison could speak. Because we usually have somebody waiting for us at home. Every eye in the room turned toward him. He smiled faintly. Family, friends, co-workers, somebody who expects us to keep showing up. That gives people a reason to figure things out. Harrison stared at him for several long seconds before quietly closing the medical file. For years he had believed humanity survived because of durable muscles, dense bones, and unusual physiology. For the first time, he wondered whether the strongest part of the species had never appeared on any medical scan at all. By the following morning, word had quietly spread beyond the medical wing, not through official announcements, but through whispered conversations in laboratories, engineering bays, and hospital corridors. Every shift seemed to include someone asking the same question. Was the human really recovering that quickly? Harrison disliked rumors, so he decided to replace them with facts. He reserved the main diagnostic conference room and invited specialists from several coalition species to review the data themselves. The room filled faster than expected. Surgeons, xenobiologists, rehabilitation experts, and military physicians took seats around the circular table while John's medical scans floated above the center display. Harrison stood with his hands folded behind his back. Everything you are about to see has been verified by 3 independent diagnostic systems. One of the senior researchers adjusted her translator. Is this presentation classified? Harrison shook his head. Not yet. That depends on what conclusions we reach today. Emily entered quietly with a fresh tablet. John followed a few moments later, walking at a careful pace. Several heads immediately turned toward him. A physician who had expected to see a patient confined to bed stared in disbelief. He is already walking? Emily smiled. Very slowly, but yes. John looked around the room. I hope nobody canceled lunch for this meeting. A few people laughed. The tension eased just enough for Harrison to begin. He expanded a timeline across the display. It showed the accident, the failed procedure, the complete loss of detectable heart activity, the unexpected recovery, and the accelerated healing that followed. Every stage matched the recorded sensor logs. There were no missing entries and no unexplained gaps. Our original assumptions were incorrect, Harrison said. We evaluated humanity by comparing them to coalition biological averages instead of studying their actual evolutionary history. A marine physician from a high-gravity world raised one hand. Are all humans capable of recovering this way? John answered before Harrison could. No. Everybody is different. Some recover faster than others. Good doctors, physical therapy, and plain old determination make a big difference. Another researcher leaned forward. Then why does your civilization produce so many people willing to continue difficult work after serious injuries? John thought for a moment before answering. Because quitting is usually more expensive than adapting. The room became quiet again. Harrison zoomed the display outward until Earth's environmental profile appeared beside dozens of coalition home worlds. Gravity, weather, seasonal variation, microbial diversity, and atmospheric conditions filled the screen. Perhaps we misunderstood the real lesson, Harrison said. Humanity did not become resilient because they expected comfort. They evolved in an environment that rarely offered any. Emily nodded. Children on Earth learn that pretty early. You fall off a bicycle. You scrape your knee. You get back on. One alien researcher blinked. Parents encourage this? John smiled. Usually after making sure you are all right. A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the conference room. The atmosphere felt different now. Nobody was looking at John as though he were an experiment. They were beginning to see him as the representative of a species shaped by ordinary hardships repeated across countless generations. Harrison closed the final medical chart and looked around the room. Our textbooks describe humans as physically average by coalition standards. After reviewing this evidence, I believe that description should be revised. He paused before speaking the sentence that nobody expected to hear from one of the coalition's most respected physicians. Average anatomy can still produce extraordinary endurance when the mind refuses to surrender. That may be the most important medical discovery we have made about humanity. By the following morning, word had quietly spread beyond the medical wing, not through official announcements, but through whispered conversations in laboratories, engineering bays, and hospital corridors. Every shift seemed to include someone asking the same question. Was the human really recovering that quickly? Harrison disliked rumors, so he decided to replace them with facts. He reserved the main diagnostic conference room and invited specialists from several coalition species to review the data themselves. The room filled faster than expected. Surgeons, xenobiologists, rehabilitation experts, and military physicians took seats around the circular table while John's medical scans floated above the center display. Harrison stood with his hands folded behind his back. Everything you are about to see has been verified by 3 independent diagnostic systems. One of the senior researchers adjusted her translator. Is this presentation classified? Harrison shook his head. Not yet. That depends on what conclusions we reach today. Emily entered quietly with a fresh tablet. John followed a few moments later, walking at a careful pace. Several heads immediately turned toward him. A physician who had expected to see a patient confined to bed stared in disbelief. He is already walking? Emily smiled. Very slowly, but yes. John looked around the room. I hope nobody canceled lunch for this meeting. A few people laughed. The tension eased just enough for Harrison to begin. He expanded a timeline across the display. It showed the accident, the failed procedure, the complete loss of detectable heart activity, the unexpected recovery, and the accelerated healing that followed. Every stage matched the recorded sensor logs. There were no missing entries and no unexplained gaps. Our original assumptions were incorrect, Harrison said. We evaluated humanity by comparing them to coalition biological averages instead of studying their actual evolutionary history. A marine physician from a high-gravity world raised one hand. Are all humans capable of recovering this way? John answered before Harrison could. No. Everybody is different. Some recover faster than others. Good doctors, physical therapy, and plain old determination make a big difference. Another researcher leaned forward. Then why does your civilization produce so many people willing to continue difficult work after serious injuries? John thought for a moment before answering. Because quitting is usually more expensive than adapting. The room became quiet again. Harrison zoomed the display outward until Earth's environmental profile appeared beside dozens of coalition home worlds. Gravity, weather, seasonal variation, microbial diversity, and atmospheric conditions filled the screen. Perhaps we misunderstood the real lesson, Harrison said. Humanity did not become resilient because they expected comfort. They evolved in an environment that rarely offered any. Emily nodded. Children on Earth learn that pretty early. You fall off a bicycle. You scrape your knee. You get back on. One alien researcher blinked. Parents encourage this? John smiled. Usually after making sure you are all right. A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the conference room. The atmosphere felt different now. Nobody was looking at John as though he were an experiment. They were beginning to see him as the representative of a species shaped by ordinary hardships repeated across countless generations. Harrison closed the final medical chart and looked around the room. Our textbooks describe humans as physically average by coalition standards. After reviewing this evidence, I believe that description should be revised. He paused before speaking the sentence that nobody expected to hear from one of the coalition's most respected physicians. Average anatomy can still produce extraordinary endurance when the mind refuses to surrender. That may be the most important medical discovery we have made about humanity. 3 weeks later, John walked through the rehabilitation wing carrying nothing more than a cup of coffee and a maintenance manual tucked under one arm. The therapist had officially cleared him for light duty, although Emily insisted he still follow every recovery guideline. "Do not make me chase you through the engineering decks," she warned. John grinned. "You sound exactly like my mother." Then your mother was probably right most of the time. As they reached the observation gallery overlooking the station's industrial sector, Harrison joined them holding a data tablet filled with new research reports. "Mr. Mercer, your recovery has started something much larger than any of us expected." John looked confused. "I only got hurt doing my job." Harrison handed him the tablet. The first page displayed updated coalition medical recommendations. Human emergency care protocols had been completely rewritten. Instead of assuming irreversible decline after severe trauma, physicians were now instructed to evaluate long-term recovery potential before making final treatment decisions. John slowly flipped through the pages. "That happened fast." Harrison nodded. "Medicine changes quickly when evidence is undeniable." Emily pointed toward another section. "Look at the engineering notes." John found several new workplace recommendations developed jointly by human and alien safety specialists. Equipment layouts had been redesigned to accommodate adaptive prosthetic technology. Recovery programs now included human physical therapists working alongside coalition medical teams. Harrison smiled faintly. "Your species has been solving problems that the rest of us assumed had no solution." Before John could answer, a young alien technician approached them nervously. He appeared barely old enough to have completed his medical residency. "Excuse me, Mr. Mercer." John turned with an encouraging smile. "What is up?" The technician hesitated. "My father suffered an industrial accident many years ago. Our doctors told him his career was over because he lost the use of one arm. After studying human rehabilitation records, we realized there may have been other options." John listened quietly. The technician continued. "He begins therapy next month." John reached over and gently squeezed the young man's shoulder. "I hope it goes well." The technician smiled with visible relief before walking away. Emily watched him disappear into the corridor. "You realize you probably changed that family's future." John shook his head. "No, doctors like Harrison changed it. I just happened to be the guy lying in the hospital bed." Harrison looked at him thoughtfully. "You continue to underestimate your contribution." They stood together watching cargo shuttles drift past the enormous station windows. Freighters from dozens of civilizations moved through the docking lanes, carrying supplies, research equipment, and people searching for better opportunities among the stars. Harrison finally broke the comfortable silence. "When humanity first joined the coalition, many believed your greatest exports would be engineering, agriculture, and manufacturing." John took another sip of coffee. "Those are pretty good exports." Harrison nodded. "They are. But I believe your greatest contribution may be something far less tangible." John looked over. "What would that be?" Harrison answered without hesitation. "Perspective. Humans accept that life can change without warning. Instead of asking whether recovery is possible, you ask what comes next. That single difference has forced every medical school in the coalition to rethink what resilience actually means." John looked through the glass at the stars beyond the station and smiled to himself. Back on Earth, millions of ordinary people woke up every morning, went to work, raised families, solved problems, and quietly adapted to whatever life placed in front of them. They never imagined that those ordinary habits would one day become the lesson an entire galaxy needed to learn. 2 months after the accident, the annual Coalition Medical Symposium opened on the orbital station with more visitors than anyone had predicted. Representatives from over 80 civilizations filled the enormous conference hall. Some had traveled for weeks simply to hear the presentation that had quietly become the most discussed event in modern interstellar medicine. Harrison stood behind the podium, adjusting the display while Emily reviewed the final schedule. John sat near the back of the room wearing a simple blue work shirt instead of a formal suit. He had argued that engineers did not belong on stage with famous scientists. Emily had smiled and said, "That is exactly why you belong here." The lights dimmed as Harrison addressed the audience. For generations, coalition medicine focused on identifying biological limits. Today we will discuss why one species repeatedly exceeds the limits we assumed were fixed. The first slides showed nothing dramatic. They displayed ordinary photographs from Earth. Firefighters carrying equipment after storms. Construction workers returning to job sites. Athletes learning to compete again after rehabilitation. Farmers repairing fences after severe weather. Parents teaching children how to ride bicycles. Confused whispers spread through the audience. One delegate finally asked, "Where are the military records?" Harrison answered calmly, "These are the military records. They simply happen to come from everyday life." Another physician raised a hand. "Your conclusion is that resilience begins long before an emergency?" "Exactly," Harrison replied. Human beings practice adaptation throughout their entire lives without realizing they are preparing for greater challenges. Emily stepped forward to explain the rehabilitation programs developed jointly by Earth and the Coalition. She emphasized teamwork, community support, and long-term recovery instead of miracle treatments. "Humans do not expect healing to happen overnight," she said. "They expect progress one day at a time." Several delegates typed notes as quickly as their translation systems allowed. Then Harrison surprised everyone. "Mr. Mercer," he called, "would you join us for a moment?" John looked over his shoulder as if Harrison might be speaking to someone else. Emily laughed softly. "Yes, that means you." John walked to the stage with the relaxed posture of someone more comfortable fixing machinery than addressing hundreds of experts. Harrison handed him a microphone. "Tell them what you told me after your first examination." John scratched the back of his neck. "I honestly do not remember exactly what I said." The audience chuckled. Harrison smiled. "You asked whether you were dying again." More laughter filled the room. John shook his head. "Well, that sounds like something I would say." He looked across the crowd before continuing. "I think maybe everybody is looking at this the wrong way. People back home are not trying to prove how tough they are. They are trying to get back to work, back to their families, back to normal life. That goal keeps you moving even when the road gets pretty rough." The conference hall became completely quiet. No dramatic speech followed. No heroic declaration. Just a simple truth delivered by an ordinary engineer. Harrison slowly nodded. "Ladies and gentlemen, that answer explains more about humanity than any medical journal I have ever read." As the audience rose in applause, John looked slightly embarrassed and whispered toward Emily, "Next year, can we please go back to fixing plasma pumps instead?" Emily smiled. "After today, I do not think the galaxy is going to let you disappear that easily." The symposium ended, but the conversations did not. Over the following months, coalition stations began reporting something unexpected. Human rehabilitation specialists were receiving invitations from worlds that had never before accepted outside medical advice. Hospitals that once considered certain injuries to be career-ending were opening entirely new recovery centers modeled after programs developed on Earth. Harrison reviewed the weekly reports with growing amazement. "This started with one patient," he said quietly. Emily smiled as she organized another stack of requests. "No, it started with one misunderstanding. The patient simply helped everyone notice it." John had long since returned to the engineering division. Most mornings looked exactly as they had before the accident. He checked maintenance schedules, inspected plasma containment systems, argued with supply officers over replacement parts, and drank coffee that somehow managed to taste worse every week. His co-workers treated him exactly the same as always, which suited him perfectly. One afternoon, while replacing a faulty magnetic regulator, his communication badge chimed. "Maintenance Bay 4, John answered. Harrison's familiar voice came through the speaker. "Mr. Mercer, do you have a few minutes?" "Depends. Is something on fire?" "Fortunately, no. Then I can spare a few." A few minutes later, John arrived at Harrison's office. Sitting across from the doctor was an elderly alien with silver scales and calm golden eyes. He slowly stood and offered a respectful nod. My name is Dr. Selen. I supervise rehabilitation medicine on the world of Kareth. John returned the greeting. Nice to meet you. Selen held out a small data crystal. This contains the recovery records of over 12,000 patients treated during the last 6 months using methods adapted from human medicine. John accepted it carefully. That sounds important. Selen smiled warmly. It is. Before these changes, many of those patients would have been encouraged to retire permanently. Today, most have returned to their families, their professions, and their communities. John looked toward Harrison. You should be the one getting credit for this. Harrison shook his head. Science explains what is possible. People decide to believe it. Selen folded his hands together. There is another reason I wish to meet you. John waited. When I was a young physician, I taught my students that the body defines the limits of recovery. After studying humanity, I realized I had ignored something much stronger. Hope also has measurable clinical value. John smiled modestly. Back home we usually call that giving somebody a reason to keep going. Selen nodded slowly. Your species has many simple expressions that carry remarkable wisdom. As John prepared to leave, Harrison walked with him into the corridor. Workers, patients, and visitors from dozens of worlds passed by, each focused on ordinary daily routines. Harrison looked around before speaking. Do you remember the first thing I said after your recovery? John laughed softly. Something about impossible biology. Harrison smiled. I was wrong. There was never anything impossible about your biology. The impossible part was my assumption that resilience could be measured only with machines. John looked through the station window where freighters drifted quietly against the endless stars. People surprise each other all the time, Doctor. That is probably never going to change. Harrison watched the ships for another moment before answering. I sincerely hope it does not. The galaxy has become a much healthier place since we stopped asking whether humans could survive and started asking how much everyone else still had to learn from them. Nearly a year after the accident, life aboard Aegis 7 had settled back into its familiar rhythm. Cargo ships arrived on schedule. Maintenance crews complained about impossible deadlines. Engineers debated over coffee that still tasted terrible. To anyone passing through the station, John Mercer looked like every other hard-working technician finishing another ordinary shift. That was exactly how he preferred it. One evening, as the artificial sunset cycle painted the observation deck in soft amber light, Harrison found John sitting alone with a paper notebook in his hands. I did not know people still wrote on paper, Harrison said. John smiled without looking up. My grandfather always said batteries never die in a notebook. Harrison took the empty seat beside him. For a few minutes neither of them spoke. Freighters drifted silently across the stars beyond the massive viewing window. Finally, Harrison broke the silence. Tomorrow I return to the Coalition Medical Academy. John closed the notebook. Going back to teaching? Yes. Although I suspect my lectures will be very different now. John laughed softly. That sounds like a good thing. Harrison reached into his bag and removed a newly printed medical textbook. The cover displayed the official seal of the Coalition Medical Council. He opened it to the first chapter and handed it to John. There, beside a simple illustration of the human body, was a sentence that had never appeared in any previous edition. Human recovery potential must never be evaluated by anatomy alone. Psychological resilience, community support, and adaptive behavior are essential clinical factors. John read the page twice before quietly handing it back. That is a pretty big change. Harrison nodded. It may be the most important correction our profession has ever made. John looked out toward the stars again. Funny thing is, nobody back home would think any of this is extraordinary. They would just call it helping people. Harrison smiled. Perhaps that is exactly why humanity continues to surprise us. You accomplish remarkable things without believing they are remarkable. A nearby family crossed the observation deck. A small alien child stumbled while chasing a toy across the floor. Before anyone else could react, the child stood up, brushed off the front of a tiny jacket, and kept running with a wide smile. The parents barely paused. They simply smiled at each other and continued walking. Harrison watched the scene with quiet amusement. I would have called for a medical scan a year ago. John chuckled. Most parents on Earth would ask if the kid learned anything. They both laughed, and for a moment the distance between two civilizations seemed to disappear completely. As the station lights slowly brightened for the evening cycle, Harrison stood and extended his hand. John accepted it without ceremony. "Thank you," Harrison said. "For what?" John asked. "For reminding an old doctor that the purpose of medicine is not merely to keep people alive. It is to help them keep living." After Harrison walked away, John remained by the window a little longer. He watched another transport disappear into the darkness between the stars and thought about how strange life could be. One ordinary accident had changed textbooks, hospitals, and the thinking of an entire galaxy. Not because one human had been stronger than everyone else, but because millions of ordinary people on Earth had quietly spent generations proving that a setback did not have to become the end of the story. Perhaps that had always been humanity's greatest strength. Not perfect bodies, not advanced technology, not fearless hearts. Just this simple decision, made every single day, to stand up one more time, help the next person when possible, and keep moving forward. Sometimes the smallest lessons travel the farthest, and sometimes an ordinary person reminds the universe that hope is strongest when it becomes something you choose, again and again, no matter what tomorrow brings.